Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan and our third in the 2018 Great Decisions series with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association of America. I'm Michael Van Dennen. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, and our mission is to equip the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We are pleased to partner with numerous West Michigan businesses and educational institutions to bring you this important series, and we particularly appreciate the extra effort of the Calvin and Aquinas College staff and faculty as our hosts. We're also very grateful to the Friends of the World Affairs Council Endowment Fund for being today's series sponsor. After Dr. Ciddi's presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions. You may use the response cards that you received when you came in, or you can text to the number that's on that response card to ask a question. Our World Affairs Council Director of Programming, Dr. Erica Kubik, will moderate the Q&A discussion, and that phone number will also be displayed on the screen behind me. We also want to remind you that there are Great Decisions guidebooks for sale with informative articles on each of this year's 8 foreign policy subjects, and you can get those in the lobby. And now, Dr. Polly Diven, who is a professor of political science at Grand Valley State University and a member of the Great Decisions Planning Committee, will introduce our speaker. Let's welcome Dr. Diven.
Thank you, Michael. Grand Valley State University is pleased to be a long-standing educational partner of the World Affairs Council and the Great Decisions series. I've been doing this for about as long as I can remember, so. Grand Valley has a very successful relationship with the World Affairs Council, and we really enjoy it as an educational opportunity for everyone, including my students. Dr. Sinan Ciddi is the Executive Director of the Institute for Turkish Studies at Georgetown University. He was born in Turkey and educated in the United Kingdom. He was awarded his PhD in political science from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London in 2007. He was previously an instructor at Cerbanci University from 2004 to 2008, and he also completed his postdoctoral fellowship at the same institution. From 2008 to 2011, Dr. Ciddi established the Turkish Studies program at the University of Florida's Center for European Studies. He's also worked at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University since 2011. Dr. Ciddi's areas of expertise include Turkey, Turkish politics, and Turkish domestic and foreign policy. He's written many scholarly articles, opinion pieces, book chapters, and other works on contemporary Turkish politics and foreign policy. He's also frequently seen in the media as a guest expert. Dr. Ciddi's book, titled Kemalism in Turkish Politics, Secularism, Nationalism, and the Republican People's Party, was published by Routledge in 2009. It focuses on the electoral weakness of the Republican People's Party. Tonight, his presentation is titled Trouble Brewing, Can the U.S. and Turkey Cooperate? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sinan Ciddi.
Thank you.
Okay, let's put this. Okay. Well, thank you very much for those wonderful introductions. And thank you to both, again, to the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan and to Aquinas College here, as well as Calvin College, for taking the time and resources to bring me out here. But also thank you for taking the time to voluntarily come and speak to me. Most people who do usually have to in classrooms. You do not. So thank you for giving up your time. Increasingly, I find it less and less common to find individuals who actually attend speaker events across the country, whether it's me speaking or where there are or other colleagues speaking. It seems to be something that I perceive to be somewhat dwindling, but I find it immensely rewarding. So thank you very much for taking the time to do this. There is an aspect of this talk which is actually specific to the bilateral relationship that undergirds US and Turkish relations in its own sort of sphere of interest. But there is also, for people who are interested outside of that, obviously, American foreign policy, which I am in no shape or form an expert in, but also just questioning where America's sort of foreign policy decision-making in the example of Turkey is headed, something that I try to sort of touch upon here. And so the essential thing that I'm going to try and do in the next 30 minutes or so, hopefully a little under, so to give you as much time as possible to grill me under these lights, is to pose at one level, a simplistic question. And it's not an academic question. This is a conversation between myself and you from the perspective of interest in global and regional affairs, which is to basically ask the question, what has gone wrong in the bilateral relations of two seemingly very committed and very long-time allies? That in itself might not be interesting, but I also believe it is a harbinger of a wider array of issues in terms of the United States' relationships with other countries and other alliances, not necessarily under the present administration, but something that is also has been in the offing, I would say, since the mid-2000s, and certainly something to take note of. So here's my starting point, and this is where I become utterly useless with visual aids. And in classrooms that I teach in, it's usually without a PowerPoint, so some people might not like me, but there we are. The picture I always have in my mind when I try to typify or position the US and Turkish historical partnership and relationship is an image. And that image is one that was in 1946. It's a photograph that was taken by a bystander in Istanbul, and for those of you who've been there, you might be able to visualize this, of the USS Missouri. And for those of you who are history buffs and naval buffs and ship buffs, which I sincerely am not, this is quite interesting because the ship itself was the USS Missouri, which was the flagship of the US Navy at the time. And if you've ever seen the USS Missouri, you will understand that this is how I understand it, it's a big ship. It's really big. As far as warships go, again, it's really big. It really essentially does two things. One, in what it was designed to do, probably at a time, was to blow things up and sink things. But in this instance, it didn't come to Istanbul in 1946 to do that. But it was a powerful symbol. It's a message. And the message that it was intended to sell at the time was directed solely at the Soviet Union. In 1946, the USS Missouri came to Istanbul and moored off its shore in the Bosphorus Straits that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, one of the most strategic waterways in the world, if you've ever seen it, to basically say to the rest of the region and reiterate the president's and that at the time's administration to the Soviet Union that Turkey and Greece would not be left alone at the hands of Soviet expansionism. And I think that is the enduring image that I have in my mind as to where the substantive relationship between the two countries began. But it's important to note this. The nature of the relationship that was established, and it's something that's going to come back to us towards the end of the conversation and of my talk, and it will draw your attention to this. This was a relationship that was established out of necessity, out of existential needs, more so for the Republic of Turkey at the time, which had come into being as a republic, formally in 1923, when the Ottoman Empire was dissolved at the end of World War I. And it also underscores that without additional strong economic and values components, to what extent can the relationship be maintained as it has been throughout the Cold War era? Now, the United States has, at then as well as now, has a lot of partners. It also has a lot of allies. it also has a lot of what is referred to, in this case also, not a lot, but a smaller number of what is referred to as strategic partners, in the case of Turkey, in the case of Israel, in the case of the United Kingdom, which is referred to as a special relationship. And the Turkish relationship was born out of, from the US mindset, an occupying area of the Republic of Turkey on the geostrategic map, which is directly located below the Soviet Union, right? And so it occupies what a lot of Turkish foreign ministry or diplomats refer to as one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate in the entire world. The immediate south of Turkey is where historically and even contemporarily, where 2/3 of the world's proven fossil fuels exist. And that was more important probably a few years ago than it is now, but it's still critical to US security and economic interests, as well as regional, if not global security interests. For the Turks, its relationship with the United States, or establishing that relationship with the United States, was absolutely critical. The Turks didn't just wake up one morning and think, we need a new friend, so let's reach out to the US. Now, Turkey had been a non-combatant power for the majority of World War II, but it did declare war on Germany and Japan in 1944, but was probably the only country after declaring war on Germany and Japan, never actually firing a shot in active war. But its desire to reach out to the Western Alliance, or the evolving transatlantic alliance as it came to be known at the time, was predicated upon an existential threat that Turkey felt, which was, if you look at the map where Turkey is located, right above it, to its entire east of it, and mostly to its northwest, Turkey was surrounded by the Soviet Union. And Joseph Stalin in 1944 made his first expression saying that Turkey needed to cede some territories, sovereign territory, land, from itself back to the Soviet Union. And also, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, decided that they should jointly administer the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, the narrow waterways which connect the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. Now this, if you look at the map again, and again this is where I fall short, and maybe I should have done this earlier, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, where there is a direct water flow, would have allowed direct access for the Soviet Navy, the entire Soviet Navy, warm water access to the Mediterranean. That was a non-starter for the United States. That is not an advantage that this country wanted to cede at the time. Similarly, for the Turks, having seen the ravaging consequences of World War II, the last thing they wanted was to be, quote-unquote, liberated by the Soviet Union. So it was a relationship that was born out of necessity and in return, a mutually beneficial one. Turkey joined NATO in 1952, became a world-class military power, and gained influence in the world. I always say that Turkey's application and joining of NATO was the most sensible and most high-yielding foreign policy decision that Turkish statesmen have ever taken, simply because if you carry the seal of a NATO country, but also a NATO country that possesses the second largest military, a contributing member of NATO in peacekeeping operations, in active combat operations across the world, then you have a reasonably high amount of stature within the organization. And in return, you get two things. During the Cold War, you get assurance, even by the Soviet Union, a superpower of its time, would think twice before attacking or requesting territory to be ceded over to the Soviet Union. Even though Turkey was militarily inferior to the Soviet Union at the time, having NATO credentials provided you a shield. But secondly, it also assured that even after the Cold War, Turkey was very much protected from the instabilities and the various conflicts that ensued the Middle East, and allowed Turkey to prosper and develop economically to a G20 country and an economic powerhouse in the region. Now, this has not always been a mutually beneficial and glad-handing relationship where everybody's been very happy to talk to each other, although American military personnel, as well as American and Turkish diplomats, they've had a very good and lasting relationship, which lasts to this day. There have been various crises up and down in the relationship. The first one, for history buffs, you will like this. I'll only mention a couple because there's been a lot of them. The first one is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which basically landed Turkey right in the hot seat. The United States, at the 11th hour of negotiations with the Soviet Union, said, okay, what will it take to remove these missiles stationed off Cuba so we don't have to go to World War III or attack Cuba and by default the Soviet Union, or preemptive strike as it was being talked about at the time. And smart people in Washington at the time, kind of smart at the time, they came up with a good idea. They said, look, if we offer a quid pro quo to the Russians to remove, at the time, short-range tactical nuclear weapons stationed in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union, which were already scheduled to be removed because they were obsolete, they were to be replaced with a newer form of missile, then maybe the Soviets will remove theirs from Cuba. So I thought, that's a great idea. And that's what they successfully negotiated with the Soviet Union. But when Turkish diplomats and the Turkish government found out about this, there was understandably a huge sense of resentment and a sense of fear and anger, because it was looked at from a Turkish perspective, as well as other NATO members, saying that the United States, under duress, under direct threat from its main adversary, was and did sell out an ally. So how dependable is this relationship? A second one that I can sort of elucidate, there's a few more, is more recent, in 2003, when the United States and its coalition partners invaded Iraq, right, to remove Saddam Hussein. The Turkish government at the time was not excited about this. This caused a huge amount of friction for a newly elected government in Turkey, which had very little foreign policy experience, had the leadership of the country, President Erdogan at the time, had virtually never been abroad, let alone stand up to George Bush, who demanded you're either with us or against us, and that Turkey should open up its airspace and military bases for a northern front that would facilitate a quicker turnaround time for a successful deposition of Saddam Hussein's regime. Okay. That caused such a stir amongst Turkish parliamentarians and the leadership that Turkey said no. And at that time, that caused a huge rebuke by military hierarchy here in this country, as well as the Bush administration and their Turkish counterparts, really resulting in a very bitter breakdown of the relationship, that Turkey couldn't be seen as a trusted ally, that it didn't come through for the United States in its newly forming global war on terrorism. Right? In each of these instances, and this is where one of the main points that I would like to emphasize, and it actually goes beyond the Turkey example, and for the wider sort of perspective and takeaway from this. In each of these instances or breakdowns, and there have been more than two that I've mentioned, what you have when such a crisis occurs, whether it's the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Iraq War crisis in the Bilateral Partnership, at the very base level, you have American and Turkish diplomats at the level of the embassies, but also at the level of the State Department in Washington, and also the Foreign Ministry in Ankara, who have established ties and working relationships. These aren't people who don't know each other. These are people who have interacted frequently with each other. They have served together. They have experienced and trusted relationships that have taken years to mold. They trust one another's intentions. They work behind the scenes to work through a public disagreement between two political entities. That's what ordinarily resolves bilateral disputes between countries such as the United States and Turkey. In addition to that, in the Turkish case, not necessarily the case for other US allies and US, you also have the militaries. The Turkish Armed Forces and the US Department of Defense, right, again, have very long established relationships. They serve in NATO together. You have Turkish military commanders who come here and vice versa. They are in joint combat operations, they're in joint diplomatic operations, or they serve in the same arenas. They have colleagues and friends. The communication levels between senior military commanders also is an additional layer whereby disputes are resolved. And in the case of Iraq and the Iraqi invasion, that was pivotal to overcoming the difficulties. And when all else fails, if those things aren't enough and there needs to be a higher level, then you have the level of heads of government. In the case of the US, you have the president who can pick up the phone to his Turkish counterpart, the prime minister, or now it's the president of Turkey, and say, hey, look, I know you have issues about this, or we've thought through about this, etc., etc. Here's a way to overcome this difficulty. And that has always prevailed. Now, what has led some since about 2012, but more so, if you want to take it back slightly more, in 2010, each of those layers have started to fail as a way of diffusing major bilateral disputes. And it has led some analysts, particularly in Washington, but also Turkish counterparts who, in think tanks across both countries, or, current or former diplomats or former military commanders, or former presidents, saying the relationship is, quote, at breaking point. That we may have reached a precipice whereby the relationship cannot be repaired. And there are two, I think, major reasons as to why this is happening. There are sort of more nuanced and more detailed sort of things that we could bring into this. But to save time and just sort of make the boldest points that I can that might sort of encourage discussion, I'm going to concentrate on two. One is based on the immediate dynamics of the region that Turkey is related in and the US position as versus the Turkish position there. And the second aspect is entirely from the perspective of Turkey's domestic political happenings. On the regional politics, on the regional sort of politics playing out, what you have that has really brought the relationship to a breaking point is, amongst other things, but most spectacularly, the case of the Syrian Civil War and the fight against the Islamic State that has really flared up particularly since 2012. Now, I could spend several more hours talking about this, but the essential problem boils down to this. The United States, since 2012, has lacked a broad-ranging policy as to what its role should be, or what an equitable solution for the Syrian Civil War and the Islamic State should be. The Turks allege and state that this is too narrowly focused on the defeat of the Islamic State without having any sort of scenario for what will happen to Syrian regime stability, who will get to run the country, the position of the Assad regime, whether he stays or goes. And that's important because that broader perspective is necessary, because if it's not, then the region could destabilize. And the interests of allied countries such as Turkey, but also foes or adversary states such as Iran and Russia, also will try to fill that vacuum. And that is exactly what is happening now. At the outset, the United States and Turkey, on the big picture, were united. Assad had to go because he was a destabilizing factor, right? And secondly, the Islamic State had to be eradicated. Now, over time, this scenario has changed. First of all, the United States withdrew its position from trying to get rid of the Assad regime or insisting on the removal of Assad. Whereas for Turkey, the existence of, the longevity of the Assad regime presented an existential national security threat to Turkey. Furthermore, the United States, according to Turkey, focused all of its efforts in trying to defeat the Islamic State without giving any consideration to regime stability or country stability and what will happen after the Assad or IS regimes falter. The United States' answer to that was work with disparate elements of the only fighting force which the US wanted to back to defeat the Islamic State in Syria, which was the Kurdish YPG, People's Protection Units, forces, Syrian local actors to defeat the Islamic State, as opposed to having US boots on the ground or possibly working with allies such as Turkey to defeat the Islamic State and, as Turkey requested, defeat or overthrow the Assad regime. Now, what you have to understand, this brought the United States and Turkey head to head. The Syrian Kurdish fighting forces in Syria, local Syrian Kurds, the YPG and their political faction, the PYD, are considered by Turkey as a terrorist organization. They are the direct offshoot, direct ally of the separatist, pro-separatist Kurdish organization in Turkey that has waged a secession war in Turkey since the early 1980s. President Erdogan's words at the time were to say, ask the US administration just a few months ago, how can you seek to defeat terrorism by working with terrorists? Why don't you work with us? Now, this has come to such acrimonious level of distrust between the two countries, whereby diplomats, military personnel, and the president cannot overcome this because it's reached a boiling point, whereby 23 days ago, the Turkish armed forces, the military of Turkey, began a military incursion into the northwest Syrian province of Afrin. You have combat troops, Turkish combat troops, targeting and shelling and killing YPG elements directly backed by the United States. And Turkey has also declared its intention to carry on after the capture of Afrin into the nearby town of Manbij, where there are US troops, where the US military said we would advise our Turkish partners not to come close or fire upon us because we will resist. And Erdogan's response has been, I would get out of there if I were you because we're coming no matter what. That looks like a very escalatory situation to me. As we speak, the US Secretary of Defense, as well as the US Secretary of State, are in Ankara trying to defuse this. This is kind of a Hail Mary pass because the Turks aren't listening. So this particular point I'm making concentrates upon a lack of clear US strategy beyond the defeat of ISIS, which local actors such as Turkey, but broadly speaking, other actors such as Russia and Iran are taking advantage of. Now, if you ask the question, well, what should be the United States' position in Syria beyond the defeat of Islamic State? That is not an answer I can provide you with. And I think this is a question that the previous administration, as well as the present administration, also grapples with. And it's not an easy decision to make, because there is no good answer to that. If you say, well, the Islamic State should be defeated, but we should also ensure regional stability so that allied countries such as Israel or Saudi Arabia certainly shouldn't be antagonized. They certainly shouldn't come into a conflict situation with other countries. There needs to be some sort of clear US policy whereby regime stability or territorial integrity of Syria is ensured, which allies can accede to. That's a difficult outcome. That will require US troops to be put on the ground, possibly. How is that going to be done, given that the previous administration looked at this rather fairly, I would think, and say, you draw me a line between point A and point B, whereby we putting another 200,000 troops or more into Syria gets us an outcome which ensures a democratic outcome for Syria, the end of its civil war, the defeat of the Islamic State. Do our troops stay there? What is their mission? Because the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan certainly aren't winning cases that have given us clear answers to questions like that. But a lack of clear strategy and just backing one group in Syria to defeat one enemy has given the pretext to countries such as Turkey to look at it and say, that's not good enough for me, so we're going to take our own action. It also, to other powers, such as our greatest adversary, the Russian Federation, to look at the United States and say, the US has signaled for the first time in a long time that it is not prepared to do anything, Therefore, we can do whatever we like in the region too. Hence, you don't even have to do anything in Syria. They've already taken territory from the Ukraine, and they've also hinted at the fact that they may be interested in attacking possibly some of the Baltic states, even Georgia. Conventional forces, even in Poland, have been beefed up by the United States. But it's local actors or regional actors, such as Iran and Russia, are calculating US inaction, therefore basically encroaching and destabilizing aspects of the region. In the case of Turkey, lack of clear policy or determined policy, which can be formulated, is driving two long-time allies apart. The second and last big reason as to why these two long-time allies are coming sort of to a breaking point is entirely related, or mostly related, I should say, because now there's a US perspective come into this, at the dysfunction within Turkey's domestic political arena. Now, to save us time, I can elucidate this in the question and answer session. But you're looking at a leader of Turkey, President Tayyip Erdogan, who is seeking essentially to be elected or re-elected as the country's first executive president. It's a term in political science that doesn't exist at all. Simply because Turkey, up until last year, was a parliamentary system. And for a variety of reasons, Erdogan is interested and has successfully displaced that system to impose a new presidential system, which will allow the president to draft and pass laws by himself without any recourse to parliament, can override any parliamentary laws that he likes, is not accountable to any judicial oversight. Okay? And in order to do this, there are other provisions of this, and he gets to select 2/3 of the Supreme Court in Turkey now, under the new system of government. You're looking at phenomenal amount of powers that has been granted to the presidency in Turkey. In order to do this, he needs to do one simple thing. He needs to receive 50% plus one vote in a general election coming up next year or possibly this year. So he needs to gain votes, one of the few democratic institutions left in Turkey, possibly. So in order to essentially convince a broader section of the Turkish electorate, half of which has consistently voted against him in previous elections, he needs issues. One critical issue which he is using to his advantage is the arena of foreign policy. What I call the weaponization of foreign policy to cajole nationalist voter sentiment in his favor. In July of 2016, Turkey experienced a coup attempt to topple Erdogan. That allowed Erdogan a pretext to look at the international arena and say, this is your moment of you're either against us or with us. To the United States, he has attributed a large part of the blame for why this coup happened. There is a cleric that resides in the American state of Pennsylvania, Fethullah Gulen. You may have heard about him or not. Michael Flynn has been implicated for trying to extradite him to Turkey for $15 million. Who knows? If there is a Russiagate, there is also a Turkeygate, believe me. And that will come out in the special counsel's investigative report, alleging to some of these characters that have been indicted. But in this case, the coup and the mastermind of the coup was allegedly Mr. Gulen. And it's, in my opinion, I don't know how one individual in America can carry out a coup d'etat in Turkey, but it also stands to me he had a lot to lose as an individual had the coup not happened. And it does seem reasonable that a lot of coup sympathizers and military personnel were sympathizers of the Gulen movement, but we have no proof beyond circumstantial evidence. Nevertheless, Erdogan has demanded the extradition of Gulen based on a joint extradition treaty that exists between the United States and Turkey. The US's position is, well, we'd be happy to take a look at that extradition request, but in order for us to be hand over a US resident to you, those accusations that hopefully you can prove have to stand up in a court of law in the US. Turkey has failed to produce that material, and Erdogan has slammed the US for harboring a coup d'etat, a coup maker, or in their rhetoric, they're saying you are harboring our version of Osama bin Laden. and we have cooperated with you historically in handing over criminals, and you are not coming through for us. To escalate this tension, Turkey has started detaining US citizens arbitrarily, without recourse to lawyers or State Department personnel, and also Turkish citizens who work for US missions in Turkey. One headline case is an American pastor who has been in Turkish jail for over 12 months, a person named Andrew Brunson. And Erdogan is on record for saying, what's the problem? You have a cleric in Pennsylvania and we have a cleric here in Turkey. You hand him over and we'll hand over this guy. That, in my book, is hostage negotiation, right? But on another level, it is really resounding with the base of Erdogan voters or people who might not necessarily support Erdogan ordinarily. It is a very powerful message of anti-American sentiment that Erdogan is using to cajole voters to vote for him. That's what I call the weaponization of foreign policy. October of this year, if you ever try to go to Turkey as a tourist from October for a brief period, the United States State Department announced that all non-immigrant visas for Turkish citizens would not be processed in Turkish embassies and consulates. That sent a shockwave through Turkey, saying basically that was one step removed from taking diplomatic measures such as removal of ambassadorships or closing down the embassies. That problem has been since overcome. But in the Brunson case, for example, what has been talked about in the US Congress, and you might see this in the coming weeks or months ahead, there are sanctions being proposed against Turkey as a result of this, simply because the arbitrary detainment of US citizens is now deemed to be an unacceptable hostage negotiation tactic used by Erdogan to essentially shore up his voter base. And the Americans are getting fed up with this. What does all this mean? Three things, and I'll be silent. Well, the earlier point I mentioned, these crises may have been overcome with a lot more poise, or both sides, in the case of Syria or in the case of Erdogan over domestic politics, may have not used the other as a weapon against the other. If there were stronger economic ties that made the relationship more vital, an economic component to this, then Erdogan might think differently. But the problem is the Cold War is over, right? There are regional disputes and security issues which both sides really do need each other with. But at this point in time, it makes much more sense for one party, perceivably, to demonize the other for short-term political gains. Beyond the diplomatic and military relationships that have undergirded the relationship, there isn't a whole lot to hold this thing together. The second point is something that's a little bit more thought-provoking for me with the incoming of this present administration since January 2017. But let's look from the glass of the Turkish lens. Historically, decision-making for foreign policy and security policy in Turkey is a very institutional process. This is the realm of the foreign ministry in Turkey. Seasoned diplomats, the foreign ministry in Turkey is a very apolitical, career-driven, very shrewdly and highly regarded institution of Turkish government, right? None of these people that work in there, or very few I would say, or in the Turkish armed forces who weigh into foreign policy decision-making in Turkey, would have allowed matters to get this far down the road in terms of being so acrimonious. But the problem is, the foreign ministry in Turkey, as well as the armed forces in Turkey, as contributors to decision-making in foreign policy, have been marginalized and sidelined by Erdogan. They do not weigh into this process. This is President Erdogan in Ankara and 7 to 10 guys unilaterally making decisions by themselves. There is institutional capture and capacity failure in Turkey. No Turkish diplomat that has served in NATO or in US missions would condone this, what's going on between the two countries, but they are helpless. But conversely, for the first time in I don't know when, I've only been here 10 years, you are seeing the same problem in Washington. the United States State Department is not an entity which is now weighing significantly, as far as we can understand, into foreign policy decision-making that the president is advocating. And that is a problem, because now you have not two institutions working behind the scenes to resolve disputes between two very critical partners, but you have two personalities which are looking at the political arena from their own personal, domestic political gain situation. And that is not necessarily something that's bad for American Turkish relations, but from your perspective, or my perspective, from the perspective of American politics, how else is that being negotiated with US interests vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis Southeast Asia, vis-a-vis anywhere else in the world? Finally, related to that, again, in the Turkish case, Turkey, for the first time in possibly as far as since the founding of the Republic in 1923, the end of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey lacks what foreign policy wonks like to call a grand strategy. Turkey's grand strategy was rather predictable. It was based on a pro-West, NATO, European Union perspective, both economically, strategically, and militarily. Turkey was one of the most indispensable and one of the most predictable Cold War allies that held the essential eastern flank of the NATO alliance intact. Intelligence gathering, forward deployment, and basically holding the eastern flank together. That has largely disappeared under Erdogan's desire to usurp power into his own hands. We don't know where Turkey stands on any given issue, least of all a grand strategy. And finally, you should note that Turkey is not alone in this. For the first time in a really long time, probably since the White House of Nixon, what is the United States' grand strategy in foreign policy? Where does that stand? And I do not mean that facetiously. There is a huge gaping absence of what the United States' position is in relation to any given geographical region. And that has been felt everywhere, whether it's the European Union, but whether it's the nearer Middle East, powers such as Egypt, Turkey, Israel, and allies in the region such as Jordan, but also in Southeast Asia. And that is having knock-on consequences that we will probably start to feel even more negatively as time goes on, such as what will be the next Russian incursion that will hurt US or European diplomatic, economic, and military interests in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, or the region. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ciddi. We're going to start with some questions, and actually, you're free to text in some questions. I may already have some, but my internet is a little slow. So I'm going to start out by just asking you quickly to maybe talk a little bit about the wider issues that are happening in the Middle East, especially in regard to what's happening with other countries. You know, where is Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia? What do they have to gain or lose with the crumbling of U.S.-Turkey relations?
That's a really good question. It helps me sort of pan out a little bit more what I was trying to sort of elucidate. I think the Turkey example serves as a really pivotal example whereby the breakdown in the relationship, right, signals to other regional actors and has signaled to other regional actors essentially that everybody's possibly free to pursue their own interests as they perceive it without a clear US presence and US dependability as presented as thought by the Turks. For example, one of the main things that are being carried out by the Russians right now, and this is, for the Russians, this is the lowest cost investment that is paying off hugely, independent of the whole Russia election interference investigation here, again, which was less than half the cost of one fighter jet, apparently. But in the case of Turkey, for example, Russia is explicitly allowing the Turkish military access to airspace that it controls in Syria so that Turkish fighter jets, in their military campaign to take out the Kurds, which are backed by the US, Russians are allowing the use of their airspace so that Turkish bombers can bomb the Kurdish YPG elements. Now you might think, well, so what? Well, the so what is this. When Turkey invaded Afrin 23 days ago, it sought the permission of the Russian Federation, saying, can we use your airspace? And the Russians said yes. And it just informed the United States that this is what Turkey was doing. I guess what I'm trying to say is the Russians are basically offering any sort of tidbit, a really attractive scenario to pull Turkey away from the sphere of NATO and its relationship, and embitter its relationship with the United States because it costs nothing. Even if it doesn't work, so what? But in this case, it is paying off because the Turkey's looking at this thinking, great, I can bomb my adversary. The Russians are helping me do this, and the US, I don't really care. Turkey's also poised to purchase a missile defense system from the Russians, the S-400 defense system, which is not a NATO system. A NATO country cannot purchase non-operable or interoperable defense systems from Russia because no NATO member would stand for that. But the Turks are doing it because it's a message being sent to Washington saying, you're not coming through for us, so here is our message. We're going to buy Russian-manufactured stuff, and that's going to really annoy you. Iran is looking at this and thinking, wow, this is a golden opportunity for us. Not only did we secure the nuclear Iran deal, the JCPOA, great. That allows us to sort of, no longer be imposed on by sanctions. But again, in the absence of the United States in the region, we can really try to impose our strategic will, our sphere of influence. And they are doing that to quite a high degree, both in Syria, but also across the greater region in terms of economic interests for now. But countries are trying to fill a void where a huge void left by the US is. And the longer term of that could be, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Egypt, that vacuum or power vacuum that was once very clearly felt there, what the US position was, is being taken advantage of by other regional actors. And that could spill over into destabilizing elements. What if a Turkish soldier accidentally fires upon an American soldier in the days and weeks coming? What will be the outcome of that? Nobody knows, and no one wants to guess.
Just a quick follow-up. What about some of the smaller GCC countries like Qatar, UAE? Do they have a role to play in this?
Yeah, they are extremely worried. Most of the Gulf states are extremely worried vis-a-vis Iranian expansionism into the region. I mean, up until now, they have been very confident that what essentially keeps them safe and sound is a steadfast commitment by the United States for US sort of presence that would essentially maintain their interests and their viability. But as we now know, as we can see very clearly on the sort of regional strategic map, that's no longer assured. The president here has basically said, well, what do I get out of it? And that does have sort of consequences why a lot of these countries, for example, Qatar, trying to find regional alliances to make sure that doesn't happen. So Qatar has allowed the Turkish military to open up a base in Qatar itself. The Qataris and the Saudis, for a time, which is no longer together, worked with the Turks to essentially take down the Assad regime. Now the Saudis have pulled out of that because the Turks no longer insist on deposing Bashar al-Assad, but Qataris and Turks still work together. So, I mean, it's fluid alliances that are typified by uncertainty of where the global international order norms, spearheaded by the United States, really have a clear position in it, just in this region alone, not to mention other regions.
Thank you. And, I'm getting tons of text questions now, so we'll try and hit as many as possible. Thanks, Mark, for sorting me out. Can we briefly talk about power? Who needs who more? Does Turkey feel like they, are the key to U.S. success in the Middle East, and so they feel like they can exert power, or do you think that's reversed? I mean, who holds the upper hand here?
Good question. Thank you. I've never served in government. I'm not a foreign policy decision maker, but I'm a woolly sort of guy who teaches some aspects of this in class, so I don't necessarily have a nuance for this sort of practicalities of this on the ground. But one of the things from statecraft, I would think is you don't want to necessarily think of relationships in that way. And I know diplomats tend not to look at, that's not a very fruitful way that rational, cool-headed, calculating actors make, especially allies. But it seems to be, where the Erdogan sort of administration in Turkey is taking things. That being said, as an American citizen, if I say from an American perspective, if I had to put this out, again, this is where I fall short. I should have put a map up there. And this is really a question of a map. If you put the map of the nearer Middle East up with positioning Turkey, it's a simple. When you talk about who needs more in this, Turkey would lose. If the relationship really became acrimonious and you had a withdrawal of ambassadors and closing of diplomatic missions, and I don't think it's going to come to that. I think it's going to hobble along just pretty acrimoniously for a while. But let's say, here's my bet. I say this in class, if you just look at the map, the simple fact remains that without Turkey's cooperation, short or medium or even long term, the US cannot achieve its security or economic interests in the Middle East, period. That is not me saying it as a citizen born in Turkey or someone that has Turkish pride. It's a simple fact that is imposed upon president after president after president. You have to suffer the Turks if they don't fall in line with you, because you have to. It's not simply a case of let's just shut up a couple of air bases here and relocate them to northern Iraq. It's not about that. If you look at you can Google this and sort of see strategic deployment of US assets in Turkey, whether it's nuclear weapons, air bases, but more than that, joint intelligence sharing centers. Not kidding, joint intelligence sharing centers. The highest and most secretive level of intelligence gathering in the region is located in Turkey. But also airspace. You can't change that, right? In the Iraq War, in the last one, had Turkey opened up its borders, not to say it would have any lasted, it would have been a cost and game changer and loss of life changer had Turkey been a cooperative partner in that. But just in the longer term, when you can't put your finger on it, but military commanders impress upon this, but more so diplomats impress upon this in the State Department. They say, you can't achieve the broad swath of US policies, strategic, military, and security in the region without Turkey's cooperation. It's folly. So from our perspective, we would lose huge. Turkey just happens to occupy a zone of territory that's critical to US interests. I'll give you one more. It was the Soviet Navy then. Now it's the Russian Navy, right? If we came into a state of active combat with the Russian Federation and, Turkey possesses the unique ability to prevent Russian naval ships from being deployed into the Mediterranean and beyond. That alone, it's the third most strategic waterway in the entire world. And Turkey knows this, outside of the Panama and Suez canals. It's the most strategic waterway in the world. You don't want, the policymakers look at this and say, okay, we have to suffer this. But even more immediately now, why have we degraded and basically defeated the broad swath of Islamic State in northern Syria? Because in the summer of 2015, Turkey lit a green light to the United States to deploy US military aircraft, fighter aircraft, and bombers from the Incirlik Air Base, southeast Turkey, which is a NATO base. So it was specifically designed, and it specifically operates for NATO combat operations. But the Turkish parliament granted it specific permission to allow the United States to conduct combat operations against Islamic State targets. You can ask, well, was it just one military airbase? Yes. Before the summer of 2015, US fighters were taking off from the Persian Gulf and the Eastern Mediterranean. By the time they reached their Islamic State targets in northern Syria, those planes ran out of fuel. Incirlik Air Base was 100 miles short of the Islamic State strongholds. That allowed American aircraft to carry out 24/7 bombing sorties and target strikes called by the YPG fighters on the ground to eliminate Islamic State targets. Just in the immediate sense, any American military commander on the ground in northern Syria would have said, are you kidding me? You suffer, you do what you have to in terms of playing around with your political counterparts in Washington and Ankara. You do what you have to, but keep this place open. Just in that immediate sense, it's indispensable. But like I said, there are longer and more strategic things people are thinking about.
So you mentioned Russia. What is the Russian-Turkish relationship right now? Are we seeing maybe more interest in establishing a relationship with Russia and Turkey now, or what's going on?
President Putin, a couple of years ago, looked at Erdogan. That's about 2014. He commented on the press saying, yeah, I like that guy. He's a tough guy. I think they sort of gravitate towards each other in terms of the tough guy stance. Turkey and Russia have a very complicated relationship, both historically and in contemporary times. During the Ottoman times, one of the main reasons why the Ottoman Empire dwindled so much was because they lost successive wars against the Russians. So there's historical animosity there. In modern times, Cold War adversaries. In post-Cold War times, Turkey is Russia's second biggest trading partner. Turkey has a very sophisticated economic relationship with the Russian Federation. Turkey is 60% dependent on Russia for its natural gas. Turkey, I don't know if you know this, virtually has no fossil fuels. We don't have any oil, not much anyway. We are completely dependent on foreign imports for gas and oil. So that presents a complication. So 60% of Turkey's natural gas comes from a pipeline from Russia down the Black Sea into Turkey and is disseminated into cities. So for industry, electricity production, heating, that's a pretty dependent relationship. And in return, Turkish agricultural producers sell the bulk of their agricultural produce to the Russians, not exclusively, but a lot. Russian tourism to Turkey is historically a lot. A lot of Russians, somewhere in the region of, I can't remember how many, 8 to 10 million Russian tourists come to Turkey every year. That's a lot. But also services and trade. Turkey sells a lot of manufactured goods, cars, semi-manufactured goods to Russia. So the economic relationship is very established, but that's not necessarily what undergirds the relationship. In terms of strategic influence, Turkey and Russia almost see very little that they are compatible with. The Russians consistently back and have very good reasons to back the ascendancy and longevity of the Assad regime in Syria. That was true during the Cold War, but even now in the post-Civil War, the Russians are very investing in the Assad regime. For them, it didn't necessarily have to be Assad, but a strong central pro-Russian regime in Syria was something that they back very consistently, whereas Turkey is not interested in that. Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet in November of, 2015? I can't quite remember now, which, if the Russians had reciprocated and fired upon Turkish jets, then that would have been an Article 5 NATO. Right now, again, Turkey and Russia seem to be cooperating for now, simply because the Russians are looking at this thinking, yeah, this is kind of working for us. What do we gain? We have a strong relationship with the regime in Syria. We can also probably burn the Kurds in areas where we have sort of maintained their independence and safeguarded their sort of livelihood by allowing the Turkish Air Force and the military access and bombing campaigns against them because, hey, burning Kurds is more preferable because it allows us to basically tear away a NATO ally from one another, undermine the NATO relationship. But over the longer term, can the relationship, is it a partnership? I don't think so. This is going to come to a head at one point or another, but right now, they seem to be able to work together. And that's really upending sort of predictable balances that we've become accustomed to.
So thinking about U.S. interests, how do we remove these thorns,
That's a really good question.
like the Kurds, the Kurdish problem or situation, but also Gulen? Should we respond in ways that are different than what we have done in the past?
Good questions. I am no fan of the Gulen movement. I mean, if you know what it is, or whatever exists in, Fethullah Gulen is a powerful cleric, and I believe he has carried out a lot of bad activities in Turkey. I don't think he masterminded the coup, but I think he was a big advocate and strong supporter of it, and he was probably involved in one way or another to topple Erdogan. That being said, he is a permanent resident of the United States. If Turkey would like to extradite him based on charges that it can prove in a court of law here, which the extradition treaty requires, and if that holds up in a court of law, fine. Put him on a plane, but that has not been done, and the US should not be placed in a position whereby you just pick up a guy, as the Turks would like, shove him on a plane and ship him off back to Turkey. We can't do that. That is a permanent resident. They have rights in this country. Due process. And this is where it becomes really warped and weird because it appears, based on allegations that has played out in the US press, as in real press, that the National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, was willing to accept a payment of $15 million to essentially allow US Special Force, I don't know who, essentially to grab Gulen out of his compound in Pennsylvania, shove him on a plane, and ship him off back to Turkey. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's mind-boggling to me. I mean, a national security advisor who is, by all intents and purposes, kind of knows like something about the rule of law and due process, and that you can't sort of do that here. So no, I mean, I don't think that is a red line for the United States. And Turks know this. It's not like Turks do not. The Turkish government or the Turkish Ministry of Justice does not know how this extradition treaty works. They know US laws, and they have advisors that can say, look, this is how it has to play out. So they're aware of this. But on the issue of Syria or how you overcome these, look, as heavy-handed and as crass as Erdogan has been, the reason why the Turkish military went into Syria, into Afrin, was understandable. I'm not condoning it, but it's understandable. And this is one thing that they've gotten, in my opinion, hugely wrong, as in the Trump administration. When Trump took office, one of the assurances he gave to Erdogan in one of the first phone calls that they had together was, okay, I'm going to stop arming the YPG, the Kurds in Syria, and soon as the IS is basically defeated, we'll basically, give you assurances. We'll work together. There won't be a new state, a YPG state in northern Syria. We'll work with you on that. Assurances were given. 23 days ago, or in January, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson gave a speech at Stanford and said a new border protection force of 30,000 fighters, the bulk of which would be Syrian Kurdish fighters, which Turkey considers terrorists, would be established. Turkish decision makers and government must have looked at this and said, are you kidding me? That was, in my opinion, a monumentally bad decision. Turks found out about us over the wires. That's like throwing gas into the fire. Erdogan must have looked at this and said, you know what, okay, you want to try and do that? And Erdogan said, you will not do that. And as a result, they said, we will eliminate that, even like the offing of that, and hence why the Turkish military has poured into Syria and is, engaged in operations. So beyond that, right now, the only thing that can be done is you need cooler heads to prevail, whereby you need heads of government, trusted senior diplomats and military commanders on both sides to sit down and sort of reevaluate and assess how we essentially get back to a tabula rasa and understand why we are allies and partners and really seek to reignite that partnership. Because the only winner out of this, as right now, is not Turkey or the United States. The real winner out of it is Russia. And again, it costs them nothing. And it is undermining the very fabric of the transatlantic alliance. It's not just the United States and Turkey, but it's eroding the foundations of the NATO alliance. The two biggest heavyweights in NATO, Turkey and the United States, are bickering. And it's spilled out onto the street, and it looks ugly. And this is even in the absence of a major global incident where NATO would ordinarily have to respond or has responded. And we will see one sooner or later, I can assure you of that.
I've got a lot more questions, so just quick kind of tag along. What about Turkey's wish to become a member of the EU? Do you think that's possible? Do you think they even desire it anymore?
The public do, but under these circumstances, no, because the retrogression and decline of democratic standards in Turkey has become so bad that EU institutions won't process Turkey's application. But also, just like he's handled the United States, Erdogan has been even more ruthless in his rhetoric against European countries. For example, last week, the Netherlands withdrew its ambassador from Turkey and will not allow a Turkish ambassador to be appointed to The Hague. That is unheard of, simply because Turkey accused it. Holland refused to allow Turkish government ministers to conduct election rallies in favor of Erdogan in Holland. And Erdogan retorted saying, wow, Nazism isn't dead in Europe.
So what is driving Erdogan? And really, is it personal power, religion? What's going on?
At some level, it's very basic. What Erdogan is doing, you have to understand, is very rational. It's not warped. He's not a psychopath. He's not a maniac. He's not, right? It boils down to corruption. When Erdogan, he's been in power since 2003, and he's come through for Turkey on economic, political, diplomatic grounds. Turkey's probably better off economically than it was before he came to power. But here's the thing. In 2014, a major corruption probe exploded in Turkey, which exposed Erdogan's level of corruption, not only his son-in-law, his family, highest echelons of the family network. Sound familiar? Yeah. Right? But this was supported not by like he said, she said. This was supported by wiretaps, video evidence, bank documents, clearly showing embezzlement of billions of dollars that Erdogan has essentially conducted in the last God knows how many years. It was astounding. And at that time, we thought that was it for Erdogan. He was done. That nobody, you had Turkish prosecutors and police raiding the houses of cabinet ministers. They were coming for Erdogan next, essentially. It all started melting down in late 2014, early January 2015. So the essential premise is Erdogan's got two choices. I didn't think he had a choice. I thought he was done. You either weather this, and by weathering it, I mean you have to basically get rid of any person who can arrest you. You have to get rid of any venue, i.e. a courtroom that will hear these cases or that consider this evidence in court. Or you, your family, you go to jail for the rest of your lives, and the entire government comes crumbling down. It makes Watergate read like a child's book, except we saw as consumers of Turkish news or Turkish citizens the hubris, the level of corruption that came out. So what did Erdogan do? Since then, he has eliminated judicial independence, fired just about any prosecutor that was not loyal to him, gotten rid of judges, appointment systems to the court, changed Turkey's system of government from a parliamentary system to a presidential one, so that the law now says that he can't be tried, he can't be indicted, that he can pass any legislation without recourse to parliament, he can annul any parliamentary law that's passed. So I'm saying he's not a maniac or a psychopath. He's acting very rationally, because if he doesn't, the consequences are too bad.
Well, that's sobering to think about how fragile everything is. And maybe as a follow-up, just to talk about what the consequences have been for Turkish people, especially thinking about intellectuals who have been, persecuted, and what's happening.
It's a tragedy beyond all reckoning. When the coup attempt of 2016 happened, a botched attempt to take down Erdogan by rogue factions of the Turkish armed forces, Erdogan looked up and looked at himself and thought, this is it. And he actually said this. He said this was a gift from God. Simply because he had been combating these allegations with prosecutors and this and that, trying to sweep, and he was successful at getting rid of the accusations and firing prosecutors and this and that. But what the failed coup attempt did was, if you play certain video games, this is like when you gain the status of superpowers for like 30 seconds, right? That you become invincible. He enacted a central part of the Turkish constitution, which provides a state of emergency rule for up to 3 months, which can be renewed by parliament. That has been renewed every 3 months since the coup attempt. The tragedy of Turkey is, since that time, as over 150,000, not kidding, 150,000 civil servants and military personnel have either been fired and or detained in jail. When you're detained in Turkey under state of emergency rule, you cannot have access to a lawyer. Charges do not have to be brought in court against you for up to 12 months. No one can come to see you. You don't have access to anything. So the rule of law in Turkey is essentially being forfeited. And once you lose your job, whether it's in the private sector or the civil, in the government sector or the military in Turkey, it's not like, wow, I lost that job, that's a major drag. Now there's a system of vetting by Turkish companies or governments. If you've been fired, they'll check you out. And if you've been fired for those particular reasons, you can't get a job. No one will hire you because they're afraid of repercussions from the government. Turkey is a failing democracy. And I always say this, Turkey was never a free democracy in the sense of being a liberal democracy, but it was a free democracy where we chose our leaders in free and fair elections. There was a semblance of due process of law, and it was a country of laws. And what Erdogan has precipitated for his own self-preservation and mobilized the entire resources of the Turkish state for his own well-being, I have never seen in any other system of government in my entire 20 years of studying this sort of stuff. It's earth-shattering for Turks. It's extremely demoralizing because there is no recourse for alternatives. You can't vote him out because he's ensured all voting mechanisms are under his control. The process of ballot box monitoring is now by civil servants, not by independent monitors. If you protest, which in this country is our constitutional right to do so, since the Gezi protests of 2013, if you protest in Turkey today, if 10 of us went out into the streets with banners to protest against Erdogan, they will deploy at least 100 police officers, and they have afforded full rights to shoot you with no repercussions. You can capture it on camera, you can anything, you can prove it. They will not be prosecuted. If you deploy 100 people, they'll come out with 1,000 people. They will use tear gas. They will, if you're not willing to back down from being a dissident, they'll go after your family. They'll arrest those as part of a collective punishment recourse. 17,000 academics have been fired from their positions. Turkey has more journalists in jail than Iran, China, and what's the other one? Iran, China, I can't remember the other one, collectively in jail. Unprecedented measures. So I'm not, anywhere I look at, it's a travesty in the making.
We really don't have time for any more questions, but maybe one more. Do you see any hope to the situation that's happening in Turkey right now?
It's really hard to actually see that. And I say that from a very humble position because I am lucky enough to be here. I carry US citizenship, and for me, that's an enormous privilege. This is home for me. But it's also, point of origin, your country of birth. I always say never underestimate the goodwill of a certain number of citizens who wish to enact change. But I have to say, the odds are stacked against people. Courts are now not in, no judge in Turkey is a judge in Turkey unless they can prove their loyalty to Erdogan. They've been vetted for that position. Same with prosecutors. And we really found out, and this should possibly give you, a sense of this. About 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, I can't remember, the Turkish Supreme Court, what we thought to be one of the last bastions whereby, existing Supreme Court judges, they're not life appointed, they're appointed for a term of a certain number of years. I can't remember how long now. I think it's, I can't remember. I don't want to mislead you. But anyway, they rendered a landmark decision saying that 2 journalists' rights, pre-trial detention, was found out to be a breach of individual rights, that they had been detained for too long without charges being brought against them, and ordered their immediate release. And as a result, because of those two cases, this was thought to be a precedent that would have freed all in-jail journalists in Turkey immediately, because it's the Supreme Court ruling. So that decision was communicated down to the lower court, which has one responsibility: to carry out that decision. The lower court doesn't have the right, at that point, it's like here. The Supreme Court renders a decision, that's it. It's the game. The buck stops there. The lower court said no. And those guys are still in jail. And that's the constitutional crisis. That is a failure of rule of law. And everyone's kind of sort of twiddling their thumbs thinking, well, what happens next? Well, I don't know. Nothing happens. So when you have no recourse to public protest rights, when you have no judicial oversight or judicial rights, when I don't know what avenues exist. But we are still very excited about the upcoming presidential elections, and I'm not quite sure why. In Turkey, that is.
Right. Well, thank you for this really thoughtful and engaging conversation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us tonight. If you'd like to carry on this conversation, we do have a talk back afterwards at Derby Station. And Kathy, there you are. Kathy Dopp of our Global Connections Group will be leading the discussion. And it's fun, right? Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And of course, next week we will be hosting Dr. Stephanie Young from the RAND Corporation, and she'll be talking about the U.S. defense budget. Also in the news right now, so please join us next week. Thank you.